If you've ever thought justice was just a wooden gavel and a black robe, then you've probably never sat in a courtroom with a guilty grin in plain sight, while the law simply looks the other way. This city is used to the dark. Case files shredded before they're filed. Surveillance footage that somehow got erased. And handshakes, quiet, calculated, between power and corruption. Nobody says it out loud, but everyone knows the system's been rotting from the inside out. Then one day, what was supposed to be just another trial turned into something else. Not because 3 white officers walked free again. That's the usual script. But because, for the first time in years, a black man walked into that courtroom, not to beg for justice, but to take command of it. But don't get it twisted. This isn't your average revenge story. This is a game of strategy, of patience, and of scars no one ever saw. A chess match set up by the underdog, played out over a decade, waiting for the perfect moment, when the men who once laughed at his pain would finally step into his trap. So when they sat there, smug and smirking like always, they didn't know the ceiling camera was no longer broken. That USB stick plugged in yesterday? It wasn't updating software. And a sharp-dressed man walking toward them? He wasn't a politician trying to clean up his image. He was the storm. And today, the storm hit land. If you've ever wondered what real power looks like when it flips the script, if you want to see a man use the law to expose the very system that once crushed him, and if you've ever lost faith in justice, then stay seated, because this story might just reignite what the world has been too afraid to believe, that sometimes the truth still gets a voice. This isn't a movie, but should be, and you're in the right place to witness it unfold. Welcome to Black Footprints, where we tell the stories history tried to bury. Hit subscribe now so you won't miss a second of truth, justice, and the voices rising from the silence. Now the real question is, are you ready to step into the fight? The courtroom didn't feel like a place for justice that morning. It echoed with smug laughter, backslaps of victory, and the heavy silence of those who already knew truth, once again, had been buried beneath layers of power and manipulation. In the defendant's row sat 3 white men, Detective Mark Sullivan, Officer Brad Collins, and Lieutenant Rick Jensen, oozing arrogance like a cologne too strong to ignore. Their posture, their smirks, their whispers said it all. We run this town. Every grin from them felt like a slap in the face of those they had wrongfully arrested, beaten down, or stripped of dignity, just for being black. Case dismissed, the judge announced, almost with a sigh. And just like that, as if the final whistle of a rigged game had sounded, the 3 officers leapt to their feet, laughing loud and proud, high-fiving like they'd just won a championship. Mark clapped Brad on the back, his voice dripping with smugness. Another day, another W, he said, grinning wide. Rick whistled as he stepped out of the defendant's box, his eyes scanning the room like a conqueror daring anyone to speak. They had been accused of the unthinkable brutality against black citizens during routine stops, planting drugs to fabricate charges, tampering with reports, even intimidating witnesses into silence. But nothing stuck. Surveillance footage malfunctioned. Audio recordings were unintelligible, and key documents, somehow, just disappeared. These weren't just cops. They were men who knew how to twist the law until it bent to their will. And the system? It didn't just protect them. It seemed designed to. Across the room, a black woman sat clutching her son's hand. Her eyes were red, not from surprise or disappointment, but from the grief of knowing she never even had a chance. Her son had once been a promising college student, until Mark Sullivan tackled him during a jog through a white neighborhood. Suspicious behavior, they claimed. He lost his scholarship, his voice, his belief in fairness. But Mark, Brad, and Rick didn't care. They walked through life as if the system owed them applause. Each trial they beat only fed their confidence. Each buried report, each silenced witness, they saw it as validation. With every win, they grew louder, more reckless, and more dangerous. These weren't just bad apples. They were the rotting roots of a poison tree. In this courtroom, justice wasn't blind. It was gagged and bound, hanging like a pretty plaque on the wall, forgotten and ignored. To them, the game was still on. What they didn't know was that just behind the heavy courtroom doors, a new wind had begun to rise. Quiet, measured, but powerful. And this time, the rules were about to change. Just as the trial was wrapping up, and the smug laughter of the three officers still echoed off the cold courtroom walls, the heavy wooden doors behind them creaked open. It wasn't a gust of air that swept through the room. It was something colder, a shift in atmosphere, a quiet but undeniable feeling that something was about to change. A tall black man stepped inside, broad-shouldered, calm, yet unshakably commanding. Like each step he took wasn't just movement, but a message. His charcoal gray suit hugged a frame built for battle. Shined leather shoes clicked softly against the marble floor like a metronome, counting down to something inevitable. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The room fell silent the moment he entered. Then, the judge, who had declared case dismissed only minutes ago, suddenly straightened up, as if jolted by memory or maybe by conscience. His voice dropped into a more formal, almost reverent tone. "Before we adjourn today's session," he announced, "I have an important statement from the city." Every head turned. Someone gasped. Someone else held their breath. "Please welcome," the judge continued, "our new chief of police, Chief Nathaniel Brooks." The silence deepened. Mark Sullivan, Brad Collins, Rick Jensen, their eyes widened in disbelief. Their skin drained of color. One of Rick's hands twitched mid-air, as if he meant to clap someone on the back, but froze mid-motion. Brad swallowed hard. Mark, usually the boldest of the three, instinctively took half a step back, without even realizing it. Chief Nathaniel Brooks. The name hit them like thunder cracking across a sky they thought they controlled. How could they forget him? How could they not? 10 years ago, these very men, Mark, Brad, Rick, had arrested Nathaniel on bogus drug charges while he was standing on a street corner, dressed in a graduation gown, waiting for a cab. They slammed him onto the hood of a cruiser, cuffed him like he was trash, tossed him into the back seat, and laughed while he begged to call his mother. They held him overnight with no explanation, no lawyer, no rights, just teaching him a lesson. His mother, Martha Brooks, rushed to the station that night, pleading for her son. She collapsed from a stroke at the front desk, ignored by the same three men now standing frozen in this courtroom. She never woke up. Now, the boy they treated like garbage had returned, not as a victim, not as someone asking for justice, but as the man now in charge of the entire system they once used as a weapon. Nathaniel stopped at the center of the room. His eyes locked on each of them, Mark, Brad, Rick. No words, no smile, just a gaze sharp enough to cut and quiet enough to thunder. And in that single stare, the whole room understood. A new era had just walked through the door, and the men who once ruled the game were now the ones holding their breath. Nathaniel stood in the center of the courtroom, the gold badge on his chest gleaming under the lights, his eyes sharp as blades. But in his mind, there were no applause, no handshakes of congratulations, only echoes from the past. The clinking of handcuffs, the slam of a squad car door, and his mother's desperate screams outside the station. 10 years ago, he stood in a similar place, but not as a leader. Back then, his hands were cuffed behind his back, his face pressed against the hood of a police cruiser, his cheeks swollen from a punch that came without warning. He had no idea what was happening. He only knew he had just graduated college, dressed in his only suit, waiting for a cab to take him and his mother to dinner. But to the three white officers watching him from across the street, none of that mattered. They didn't see a young man full of promise. They saw a black man standing alone in a white neighborhood. And that was all it took. Rick was the first to move, shoving Nathaniel in the chest hard enough to knock the wind out of him. Brad yanked his arms behind his back like he was a threat to society. Mark, still a lieutenant then, smiled as he read out some half-baked excuse about probable cause. They didn't need a reason. They only needed a prejudice. And the system? It stood silently behind them. That night, Nathaniel wasn't allowed a phone call. No explanation. No lawyer. Just flickering fluorescent lights, the chemical sting of old leather in the holding cell, and the choking realization that everything he had worked for could be taken away in a heartbeat. His mother, Martha Brooks, rushed to the precinct that night. A small, soft-spoken woman in a worn-out dress, voice trembling with fear. She pleaded with the desk officer, tears streaking her cheeks. "My son didn't do anything wrong," she said, gripping the counter. "He just graduated. He was just waiting for a ride." But no one listened. Not that night. She collapsed from a stroke right there at the front desk. The paramedics arrived too late. She never woke up. Nathaniel wasn't even allowed to see her. By the time he was released the next morning, there were no apologies. No explanations. Just one cold sentence from behind the desk. "Next time, don't wander around that neighborhood." That wound never fully healed, but it didn't kill him either. Instead, it forged something deeper. Nathaniel turned down a coveted athletic scholarship. He didn't choose fame. He chose law. He studied quietly, relentlessly. He joined the FBI, starting from the bottom, learning how to dismantle a system that once nearly destroyed him. He learned how to watch without being seen, how to gather evidence, interrogate suspects, and uncover what others wanted hidden. And over time, he learned exactly how officers like Mark, Brad, and Rick had poisoned the very foundation of justice. And now, he was back, standing in the same city that stole his mother, his youth, and almost his soul. But this time, he wasn't here for revenge. He was here to restore order. From the inside, using the very law that once betrayed him. Every step he took today was a declaration that his past may have tried to break him, but it would never define him. That his pain wasn't wasted. It had become his purpose. And this time, he was the one holding the cuffs. They thought he was just another fresh face. A name buried in a departmental email. A crisp new uniform with a shiny badge. A mayoral appointment announced with polite applause and a few cautious side eyes from the old guard. To them, Chief Nathaniel Brooks was just another black man picked for optics, for politics, for appearances. They had no idea. He'd already been there. For a long time. Over a year earlier, Nathaniel had returned to the city, not under bright lights or camera flashes, but in a navy blue jumpsuit and a worn baseball cap. The name on his badge read, Nate Brown, listed as a contract technician assigned to maintain security systems at the police department and city hall. No one noticed the cable guy. No one questioned the man plugging in USB drives. And certainly no one suspected that the man they once tried to destroy was quietly piecing together their downfall. For over 12 months, Nathaniel watched, listened, recorded. He camped in an unmarked van outside department buildings, tapped into internal cameras, planted discreet mics in briefing rooms, and embedded mini recording devices in the file folders of the very officers he was hunting. And slowly, the rot began to show. He captured Mark Sullivan accepting a thick envelope of cash from a car wash owner in exchange for special protection from inspections. He filmed Rick Jensen calmly planting a Ziploc bag of drugs in the trunk of a 16-year-old black teenager's car. And worst of all, he caught Mark, Brad, and Rick laughing in the break room, swapping tips on how to edit incident reports to turn victims into suspects. But Nathaniel knew surveillance wasn't enough. He needed a voice from the inside, someone who had seen it all and was finally ready to speak. He found her, Officer Emily Dawson. Young, white, smart, and terrified. She had seen Rick choke an unhoused man who refused to leave a city bench. She had overheard Mark referring to a black suspect as a walking monkey. She had said nothing for years, because she feared what would happen if she did. Until the night Nathaniel found her. In a dimly lit parking lot behind the precinct, still dressed in his coveralls, Nate, not chief, not FBI, just Nate, handed her a flash drive and said just 4 words. "They killed my mother." That was all it took. A week later, Emily delivered the final piece, a recorded conversation between Rick and Brad, casually discussing how to handle a fellow officer who was thinking of reporting them. It was the missing puzzle piece Nathaniel needed. And at that point, he wasn't just collecting evidence anymore. He was setting the board. When the city officially named Nathaniel Brooks as chief of police, the entire department buzzed. Some called it progress. Others muttered about politics. But only Nathaniel and Emily knew the truth. The moment he walked through those doors in uniform wasn't the beginning. It was the end, the final act of a mission built from pain, discipline, and the slow, calculated work of a man who never forgot. This wasn't luck. It was strategy. And now, he was back to reclaim everything they took. That morning, the city police headquarters was eerily quiet, like someone had flipped a switch and shut off the usual current of arrogance that buzzed through its halls. There were no smug jokes from the veteran officers, no slamming office doors, no crude banter echoing between shifts. Everyone knew why. Today, Chief Nathaniel Brooks officially took command. His name had barely been announced over the intercom, yet somehow it had already shaken the entire department to its core. When Nathaniel stepped in the main conference room, every head turned. His deep blue uniform hugged his powerful frame. The gold badge on his chest glinted under the sterile fluorescent lights. He didn't bring a welcome speech. No small talk, not even a smile. He had only one mission. His eyes scanned the room, steady, piercing, until they landed. Lieutenant Rick Jensen, Officer Brad Collins, Detective Mark Sullivan. Stepped forward. The air went still. A few younger officers exchanged nervous glances. Rick rose first, dragging his feet. Brad adjusted his tie, as if that might steady the knot in his throat. Mark, usually the cocky one, moved slowly, his eyes dulled, his swagger gone. Now, the three stood before Nathaniel, the man they had once humiliated like a toy they could break and discard. But today, there was no power in their posture, no shield from above. They were face to face with the consequences. Nathaniel placed a black leather case on the table. He opened it, pulling out a thick red-bound folder. Inside, photographs, audio transcripts, surveillance footage, witness statements, bank receipts, all the puzzle pieces they thought had been buried for good. These, Nathaniel said, his voice calm, almost cold, are the things you've done. The unlawful arrests, the planted evidence, the dirty money exchange for freedom. Mark forced a smirk, hoping to spin it back in his favor. We were just following procedure. Nathaniel met his gaze, unflinching, unwavering. No, he said, voice like steel. You were following greed, fear, and hate. Stop lying to yourselves. Silence gripped the room. Then Nathaniel turned to the internal affairs officer and gave a nod. Based on the evidence presented and corroborated by internal testimony, he declared, I am placing all three officers on immediate suspension pending a full investigation. Effective now, they are barred from returning to duty under any capacity. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, local headlines exploded. New police chief drops the hammer. 3 senior officers suspended on day 1. In the conference room, a young officer who had once been threatened by Rick for refusing to falsify a report gave a slow, almost reverent nod. Another placed his hand on the table, as if finally releasing a weight he'd carried for years. The era of untouchable power, of corruption hiding behind badges, was over, and it had been torn down in one morning. Nathaniel stood silent, steady. His eyes never wavered. Inside, he whispered just 4 words to himself. This is just beginning. One day before the official suspension orders were issued, while the air inside the precinct still felt thick with tension but hadn't yet exploded, Chief Nathaniel Brooks did something no one expected. He invited Mark Sullivan, Brad Collins, and Rick Jensen to his office. No formal memo, no public notice, just a quiet request for an off-the-record conversation between men who've all worn the badge. He probably wants to avoid a scandal, Brad muttered as the 3 of them walked toward the frosted glass door. Trying to save face on his first week. Mark scoffed. Told you. He's just a PR pick. He knows damn well who really pulls the strings. The room was modest. A long table, 4 leather chairs, a pot of coffee, a ticking wall clock that somehow made the silence feel louder. Nathaniel was already seated, his posture relaxed, a faint smile on his face, like he genuinely wanted a calm, man-to-man talk. Thank you for coming, he began. I thought, rather than escalate things, maybe we could have an honest conversation. I don't want my first day to become a battlefield. The 3 officers exchanged glances and eased into their seats. Rick laughed. Knew it. Dragging this out in public helps no one. Let's just bury the whole damn thing. Nathaniel nodded, still calm. I want to understand how things really worked around here. So, I know where to start fixing it. And just like that, they began to talk. Like three foxes who still believed the hen house was theirs. Mark bragged about how he once cleaned up a repeat offender by slipping a few pills into the guy's trunk. Saved everyone the paperwork. Brad chuckled as he told the story of how he accidentally lost the body cam footage of Rick choking out a homeless man in the park. And Rick, ever the boldest, leaned in to share how he used to put rookie black officers in their place to teach them who really ran the department. Nathaniel listened, occasionally nodding, even offering a chuckle or two. But behind his still eyes, something was calculating, watching, tracking. When they finally stopped talking, thinking they had just schooled the new chief, Nathaniel leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. "I appreciate your honesty," he said slowly. "Really, because—" He reached under the table. Click! The frosted glass behind them darkened. It turned into a screen. And then the entire conversation they just had began to replay. Word for word, voice for voice, uncut, unfiltered, undeniable. Mark froze. Brad stammered. Rick shot to his feet. Nathaniel stood, straightened his badge, and looked at them the way a teacher looks at three kids caught cheating on the final exam. This meeting, he said, his voice no longer soft, was live-streamed to Internal Affairs, the City Ethics Committee, and the Federal Civil Rights Division. "You wanted to play the system?" he said, stepping around the table. "I rebuilt the board." Silence swallowed the room whole. No more swagger. No more bravado. Just three pale faces staring down the barrel of their own words. And Nathaniel? He was just getting started. The first checkmate was on the board. That day, the courtroom didn't feel like a place for whispered side comments or smug shoulder pats behind the defendant's table. It felt like an arena, a moment carved into history. The seats were packed, reporters shoulder to shoulder, cameras turning nonstop, and rows of black citizens who had once been wrongly arrested, silenced, or afraid. Now, they sat in the front row, eyes locked on the proceedings. Some wore T-shirts printed with the words, "Justice doesn't expire." At the defense table sat three men who had once haunted this community: Mark Sullivan, Brad Collins, and Rick Jensen, now reduced to shells of their former selves. Wrinkled shirts, loosened collars, eyes dull and drifting like hunted animals at the end of the line. The prosecutor stepped forward, firm voice cutting through the air, holding up a thick file that read like the soul of the city, demanding to be heard. "Your Honor," he began, "we have clear video footage of Officer Collins accepting cash from a known drug dealer in exchange for turning a blind eye. We have hidden camera evidence of Lieutenant Jensen planting narcotics in the car of a black teenager with no prior record. And we have a recorded conversation, spoken by the defendants themselves, admitting they altered more than 20 arrest reports over the last 2 years. A video played on the courtroom's large screen. Mark Sullivan, standing before a hidden camera, laughing as he described how he cleaned up a black suspect with a quick kick, right in front of the camera that wasn't working. In the gallery, some people bowed their heads. One elderly woman squeezed her son's hand. He had once spent 18 hours in jail without ever being charged. The charges, the prosecutor continued, include abuse of power, fabrication of evidence, systemic racial discrimination, bribery, and gross misconduct in public office. The defense attorney tried to shift the narrative, but it fell flat. Empty words against a storm, buzzing like a mosquito in a hurricane. Then Brad exploded, slamming his hand on the table. "We were set up. That bastard Brooks, he trapped us." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. From the front row, Nathaniel Brooks slowly rose. No microphone needed. His voice carried like the courtroom was built to deliver it straight into history. "No," he said, his gaze like a blade. "I didn't trap you. You've been burying yourselves for years. I just showed the city the hole you dug." A heavy silence fell like steel. The judge lifted the gavel. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood. No hesitation. No need to check the paper. "Guilty on all counts." The room erupted. Applause thundered through the chambers. Some people sobbed. Others embraced, finally releasing a pain they had carried too long. Reporters flooded the exits, phones to ears shouting, "We just witnessed history." The three former officers were cuffed at the table. Rick hung his head. Brad clenched his jaw. Mark closed his eyes, as if trying to wake up from a nightmare that wouldn't end. As they were escorted down the center aisle, they passed the public benches, where eyes didn't scream with rage, but looked at them with something colder. Recognition. Exposure. Because sometimes the price of guilt isn't prison. It's the world finally seeing who you really are. And Nathaniel Brooks? He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He simply looked up, toward the faded words etched above the judge's bench. Words that had gone ignored for far too long. Equal justice under law. And today, those words had finally come alive. Nathaniel Brooks stepped out of the courthouse like a man who had just closed the door on the past, while still holding the key to the future. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, its light glinting off the weathered stone beneath his steady stride. Cameras flashed. Reporters jostled, but there were no sirens, no security detail, just the echo of his footsteps, firm, deliberate, pounding like the heartbeat of a city that was finally waking up. Behind him, the heavy courtroom doors shut with a final thud, sealing in the sobs, the cheers, and the hollow defeat of three men who had once ruled an institution like self-appointed kings. In a system where justice had long been reduced to a decorative slogan on a wall, today, the wall had spoken back. At the foot of the steps, the crowd waited. Some held up handmade signs. Justice finally speaks. Others simply pressed their hands over their hearts as Nathaniel's eyes met theirs. To many, he was a hero. To others, a threat to the status quo. But to himself, Nathaniel was something else entirely. A son coming home, with a vow etched in blood the day his mother died. A vow that evil would no longer hide in the dark without a fight. A young reporter stepped forward, mic trembling in her hand. "Chief Brooks," she asked, voice breaking under the weight of history. "Today you did what no one's done in decades. Is this the end of corruption in this city's police department?" Nathaniel paused, turned, and for the first time all day, he allowed a smile. Not a victory, but of resolve. The kind of smile that comes when you've just laid the first brick in something that might finally last. "No," he said, his eyes locking with the lens. This wasn't a trial for three men. This was the first trial of an entire system, a system that's grown far too comfortable forgiving the unforgivable. He stepped down a few more stairs, closing the distance between him and the people who mattered most. "And I'm not done," he said, voice rising, conviction pouring from every word. "Justice isn't a match to be won. It's a journey, and I'm walking it to the end." For a moment, silence held. Then came the applause, scattered at first, then rolling in waves. People clapped, cheered, cried, not because three men had fallen, but because someone, finally, had stood up. Nathaniel scanned the crowd, and in that instant he didn't see fear or weariness, like the day he'd once been thrown into the back of a squad car with no cause. He saw hope. He saw people waiting, and he knew he wasn't alone. High above the courthouse, a banner was unfurled from the building's facade. "Serve with honor. Lead with justice." Nathaniel Brooks nodded once, bowed slightly to the people, then turned and walked away. A chapter had closed, but the book of justice, the one he'd written in loss, pain, and unshakable belief, was only just beginning. In this next chapter, no one would be allowed to sit on the sidelines.